And so I'm assuming these bills also talk about barriers to participation. In general, we know that African Americans and other people of color tend to have lower wages, or maybe you use public transportation more than their own cars. So those are things that may impact their availability to be able to take part in these things. So are there ways to address those barriers?
I love that you bring up barriers because we've
Mhm.
talked about this a lot. How do you, so not just getting more bodies in and putting in goals, but what tactics are you actually instilling on clinical trials that will allow them to do that? I have a talk that's coming up in Boston. It's the Health Equity in Clinical Trials Congress is coming up.
Hmm.
And there's other conferences that have been going on for quite some time for the past year or so, where they're starting to ask questions to sponsors or, pharmaceutical companies. What are
Mhm.
you doing?
Mhm.
And the biggest thing is when you think about participating in a clinical trial, these things can go on for weeks, for months.
Mhm.
And that takes time, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes these site visits that they call them, because you have to go to the site to get your drug,
Mhm.
sometimes they could be up to 3 hours long. Let's say you live an hour away, so you drive an hour, you go sit, takes you 3 hours to get through that, and you got to drive back. That's
Mhm.
half a day gone already. Patients are taking time out of their day. Now, of course, the trade off people would say is, well, they're getting a drug that may be improving their quality of life. They're like, yes, but I'm missing half a day of my life. And if
Mhm.
I'm having side effects,
Mhm.
who knows how long I'm going to be down for the rest of the day or week. So studies have started to do financial compensation. Now, these
Mhm.
financial compensation can come in a couple of different ways. They can either pay you for your time in the trial, or
Mhm.
the other way that they do it is by covering costs for transportation to get to that, or
Mhm.
childcare, elderly care, things
Mhm.
along those lines. They will make sure to cover all lab tests and other things associated with the trial, so you're not getting hit with it. Your insurance company's not being hit. Those are ways that those things are kind of coming in, and that makes a big deal. I think the other thing too is even if you're doing this type of financial compensation, the trial's an hour or more away.
Mhm.
So are we doing better with placing sites in their community? And by partnering with these guys, because sometimes these new doctors that we pull in to studies may not have research experience. So are
Mhm.
we setting them up for success? Have we given them a mentor? Have we
Mhm.
trained them well on how to set up their research program? There's
Mhm.
so many different factors that go into it that we're thinking about with this that patients don't see all of that was happening,
Mhm.
right? And if financial compensation is a big deal for you, ask that question when you're talking about a trial. Say, there's a financial compensation, can I get paid for my participation in this? They'll tell you. They'll be able to explain to you yes or no or what's covered, right?
Mhm.
So there's many things that go into it, and this is why these trials can be quite expensive. But when you're trying to figure out ways to make it more accessible to patients, so like if they don't have to go to the site, maybe they can go to a local lab. So they can go to a LabCorp or a Quest Diagnostic instead
Mhm.
of having to drive to the doctor's office. Or depending on how the drug is administered, let's say it's an oral or a
Mhm.
topical, like something you can put on yourself. Maybe it can get shipped to you directly, so you don't
Mhm.
have to go to the site. Instead of filling out paper diaries to say, well, how are you feeling today and what has been your experiences? Maybe you can do it electronically on your phone, right?
Mhm.
Or on a tablet that they'll provide. So
Mhm.
there are different ways that they're trying to do this to really reduce the barriers that a lot of patients are facing. But
Mhm.
that comes into multiple things that can play into it. So financial compensation, choosing
Mhm.
the right location for sites, getting them transportation, thinking of ways to bring the trial closer to them. All kinds of things go into it. And it's very, very interesting and very complex
Mhm.
to deal with.
So if you participate in studies like this and you do receive some financial compensation, is that money taxable?
So from what I remember, I don't think that it is.
Mhm.
And the biggest thing is that it's really a way to kind of cover or expense of being able to participate in the study, right?
Okay. Mhm.
Now, from country to country, that can vary because some of them do have stronger rules or regulations over others.
Mhm.
But you're starting to see more and more studies, especially in the US, that are focusing on trying to financially compensate patients.
Mhm.
Because again, it is a lot of time that you're putting into it, and
Mhm.
people need to really think about what the patients endure when they're going through a study. Like that
Mhm.
is something that we do not like, we think we know, but it's
Mhm.
like watching a person go through chemo, right? And you're like, what do you need exactly? And you don't know
Mhm.
until you go through it, right? But we've
Mhm.
seen enough people go through it that we kind of get an idea, but it still varies from person to person.
Mhm.
So this is why It's very important to really think about the patient. And this is why patient voice is important to use, because you get to bring in patients who, again, can tell you what they like or did not like about a study design. What are
Mhm.
their motivations? What are their concerns? What are their challenges? You
Mhm.
take that and you use it to build out your study. Similar to what we saw in clinical trials, who you're using for patient voice can still be heavily skewed in white patients because they're aware of it. They're more willing to come talk about it.
Mhm.
And I made it very obvious in my time here at my job that we need to change that, bring in,
Mhm.
do better with getting me more representation. And we
Mhm.
actually did a study where we were actually able to kind of almost have a 50-50 split, or actually a little bit more than that, of non white representation in our patient voice. And it was perfect because now we were able to actually sit and listen and draw out themes and
Mhm.
challenges from these other groups we couldn't do before. It was very interesting to hear what their motivations were compared to their whiter Asian counterparts.
Mhm.
So there are some big differences in what motivates a patient and
Mhm.
what are they actually looking for. That can also drastically change too.
Mm. And then what are, in the event that there are some adverse effects from these trials, what type of safeguards do patients have, or how are we safeguarding them in their health moving forward?
Oh yeah, so you're monitored a lot.
Mhm.
So when you start, they're going to ask you questions, right? Like, how
Mhm.
are you feeling? What's been new? Has anything changed? Have you experienced any side effects? And you're monitoring that to see what are you actually experiencing. They're
Mhm.
going to be tracking you and doing blood work and other types of tests periodically throughout the trial to see,
Mhm.
well, how well is your disease progressing or not progressing? And that is where if the patient is saying, look, I'm having a really hard time, I feel like the symptoms that I were having is has gone away, but I'm having some intense like intestinal cramps, or
Mhm.
I got this cough that won't go away, or whatever the case may be. Patients need to be very honest. And
Mhm.
if they're starting to see that your health is being impacted, or the patient says like, I can no longer do this, as I was saying earlier, you can stop the study. You can drop out. And a lot of times doctors can make that assessment if they see that your health is being impacted or your quality of life is decreasing, that they
Mhm.
will pull you from the study and to make sure that you're taken care of. But again, this is where watching a patient and paying attention and the patient's paying attention is critical, because those are the guardrails that you have in place, right?
Mhm.
This is why they have to go through multiple rounds before you even get to that point to
Mhm.
know the dosing and efficacy and safety,
Mhm.
right? Like they need to know, is it safe? Are we killing people? Right? These type of things are in place, and you have to be notified of the type of drug that you might be getting. Now,
Mhm.
of course, sometimes it could be a blinded study, so you don't know if you got the drug or the placebo,
Mhm.
but you are made aware of what that drug is and what the
Yeah.
study is about,
Mhm.
right? Before, when we think about Tuskegee, when we think about some of these other studies, especially like the birth control pill that was being study that was done in, I think, in Puerto Rico,
Mhm.
individuals were not told the truth about what was happening to them,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
Henrietta Lacks, they took her
Mhm.
cells and they never told her what they did with them afterwards, right? She
Mhm.
died without knowing. There have been studies that have been done without telling patients what is actually happening. What are
Mhm.
they taking? Why are you taking it? But
Mhm.
you can't do that anymore, right?
Mhm.
When you go in, there's papers for you to read through. There's a
Mhm.
staff member who's going to explain to you what you're getting yourself into.
Mhm.
There's a number and support buddies that you can connect to throughout
Mhm.
the study to say, I don't understand something. So there's
Mhm.
going to be options and support systems there for you. And like I said, you always have the option to drop.
Mhm.
But they had to change that because of all these things that have happened,
Mhm.
right? So, but again, people still have their hesitancy, and I never fault a person for having any type of hesitancy or giving a side eye.
Mhm.
And I tell them all the time, like you're very justified in how you feel, and I think that is what changes the tone for most people. That you're
Mhm.
not dismissing their feelings, and you're saying that it's valid because of what has happened. If we
Mhm.
did that more often and tried to meet the person where they were instead of becoming very defensive and saying, "Well, you don't know what you're talking about," and you
Mhm.
just always get stuck in the past, it's like that's stuff that we've been through. I've known people. When you think about the history of Black people in America, it's not that many generations removed. Okay,
Mhm.
when you think back about this,
Mhm.
so it's not that easy for us to be like, "Oh, okay, let's just move on with this," right? So
Mhm.
I think the biggest thing is that when you actually are truthful and you're meeting them where they are and saying, you're right, these things did happen, but let
Mhm.
me show you what we're doing differently that allows you to have the power to say yes or no and to
Mhm.
leave when you want. And if
Mhm.
you ever have questions, here's where you can find that information.
Mhm.
Now, is that information written in easy to follow language? Not all
Mhm.
the time. And
Mhm.
that's something else as well that you're now seeing a lot of organizations have to change. What's the readability of this? You have a
Mhm.
wall of text. Is that really going to be useful for a patient? Can we do this in a video? Can we
Mhm.
use pictures? Can we simplify this? Cut down the number of pages when we have in our consent form. But are we providing other options for people? Like
Mhm.
maybe your vision is bad. Do we have a
Mhm.
braille option, an
Mhm.
audio option? Think about that. Or you're colorblind. I can't
Mhm.
see those colors. That can't make that out. Do you have a colorblind option?
Mhm.
Things like that. I think it's very interesting when you get into it. But again, that level of access, it's access as much as people do not like to admit it. It's
Mhm.
simply that it's very much a thorn in the side of many non-whites in the US and in other parts of the world where socioeconomics plays a big role in you being able to have access to information, to have access to care, and to have access to just knowing what your options are. And
Mhm.
we don't talk about that enough.
No. I want to think too about bedside manner. That's something that all patients deal with, definitely patients of color, in particular African American patients. And as I was looking into some of the research, the two things that stood out to me is that some African Americans were saying they don't necessarily trust white doctors to fully explain all the implications of studies and things to them and participating. And then also on the side of the white doctors, there's a lack of trying with recruiting African Americans because there's a concern that they will not remain compliant, which seemed like a very, very loaded word.
Yes.
When you talk about implicit bias and you think about like other things you hear where Black people in the workplace simply for speaking up or not smiling or not going to happy hours are seen as defensive when it's really just very neutral, but it's seen as oppositional and defiance. Where do we kind of strike that balance and understand, and with white physicians understanding what you may see as not being compliant is simply we don't have to be smiling and happy to simply exist and to
Listen,
get this information.
yes,
Yeah.
you hit it on the head. And this is where cultural awareness,
Hmm.
cultural humility is
Hmm.
important.
Hmm.
And there are companies out there now who are doing this type of training or providing training
Hmm.
for physicians, for their
Hmm.
staff, so that they can understand that.
Hmm.
And there is a notion that, oh, well, why don't we just get a bunch of Black doctors and Hispanic doctors and that will fix our problem? But you know the phrase, not all skin folk are kinfolk.
Hmm.
So just because you may look like me doesn't
Hmm.
necessarily mean that you understand me.
Hmm.
You could be coming from a Black person who is from a wealthy upper middle class
Hmm.
family. You do not have the same troubles as someone who grew up in the lower class, right?
Hmm.
You don't understand what it's like to have to deal with a lack of infrastructure for your
Hmm.
day-to-day living. When we think about this, it's like just because a person is Black does not give them a pass. Because I have known of some doctors who have had excellent recruiting history, great, strong number of patients that are coming in being recruited who are actually getting enrolled in the study, low
Hmm.
dropouts. And they're like, well, we need to focus on diversity. And they're like, I don't want to mess up my numbers.
Hmm.
You're like, but you're in an area where there's a high amount of Black and Hispanic patients. Yeah, I get that. But they don't want to do the study. And how do you know this? Well, they're not compliant with their drugs. And you go, let's think about the drugs that you have them on.
Hmm.
Have you stopped to think that maybe, just maybe, insurance has prevented them from being able to get this on a more consistent basis?
Hmm.
Stop to think that maybe the drug, although it helps them with the primary condition, has caused them to have some secondary issues that they're like, you know what? I try to take this less often so I don't have to worry about puking my guts up, right? Or sensitivity to light, or I'm getting migraines, or whatever the case may be. So now you got other things that are happening, right? Or have you stopped to think that maybe they're not compliant because life got in the way and they had to start taking care of their folks or their
Hmm.
siblings?
Hmm.
Child got sick, spouse got sick, they lost their job, whatever the case may be. Like, have you stopped to think about that when they're telling you this drug isn't working and you're saying you're just trying to go through all these drugs? Like, really listen to what the patient is telling you. It is not
Hmm.
working for me. I think it's supposed to, but it's not. And that's where we challenge doctors on that, because they're
Hmm.
so used to hearing they're not interested, they're not compliant, or they're going to drop out. And what
Hmm.
we have found in studies is that really non-whites, once they get into a clinical trial, are less likely to drop out than their white counterparts. And
Mm,
the reason being is because this is another form of treatment for them,
mm,
just some option. This is like
mhm,
their last resort sometimes because they've been
mm,
trying to get in to
mhm.
find someone to help them with their issue.
Wow.
So the thing is that the fact that doctors, and when you think about some white physicians, and some white physicians actually get it.
Mhm,
They do because they're like, hey, I'm not taking the drug, but you are. I have to base it off of what you tell me. There's a doctor who's down in Morehouse. She's an Asian woman, right?
mhm,
And she's in within BI, Dr. Julia Liu. And she works at Morehouse. She's the only Asian woman, like the physician, but all of her patients are black.
mhm,
And she said, you know, when she first came in, they were like, oh, I got an Asian doctor. But she's been such a big advocate for them and kept raising the awareness. Hey, black people got IBD. I got tons of patients here. Come on, change time. Like, I need you guys to bring me trials. She's changed the game down there at Morehouse, but she's not black. And if you go and look at her papers that she's published, where she's tried to get it out there about black patients in IBD, if you
mhm,
look at the talks that she's done, she's very like cut and dry. Like, look, this is ridiculous. You're not listening to what I'm trying to do here.
mhm,
That's the piece for me. That's where we have to start showing those type of stories of
mhm,
doctors who don't look like they're patients but are really doing the work. So yes, there are patients who deal with white doctors who are being dismissed, who are being
mhm,
overlooked.
mhm,
But there are also doctors out there who are white
mhm,
or do
mhm,
not look like they're patients that are doing the work. And
mhm,
it's the same on the flip side. Sure, having someone who looks like you, they can speak it, they understand where you're coming from, they understand the resting face that you have. It's not rude. You're
mhm,
just like, look, it's been a long day, and now I
mhm,
gotta sit here and talk to you. Nothing against you. It's just I'm tired. But they understand that, right? Or like if you get loud, it's not like you're being rude. It's just like
mhm,
you're excited or you're animated. Things like that, right?
mhm.
And but then you also have it on the same side of that with doctors who look like us who just aren't right. So I
Yeah.
think it really comes down to the individual doctor, but
Mhm,
having the fact that there's training out there and the fact
mhm,
that we have the option to work with them or not is the biggest piece of it.
mhm. Excuse my ignorance around this because I'm obviously not a medical professional, but I know that nurses have to get like continuing education credits. And so I'm assuming that physicians and doctors and physician assistants have to do it as well. Is there some regulation that you have to get continued education around working with people of color or anything like that? No. Wow.
No. And so
Mhm,
the thing is that you can become board certified, right?
mhm,
But there isn't any set guidelines or rules, right, where you have to do cultural training. I do think that medical schools are starting to look at that a little bit more.
mhm,
And I do think that they will get their training through real world
mhm,
experiences. But the fact is that if sponsors like my company or pharmaceutical companies are starting to say, hey, it's required that you have taken cultural competency and awareness training
mhm,
to participate on a trial, that
mhm,
could be a way that you could do it. But then they
mhm,
would get a certificate out of it saying, hey, you've completed this training. You could put it up in your lab, in your office, or at your site to say, hey, look, right? And you can hold these sites accountable. But this is where I think paying attention to patients, hearing feedback about these sites is important. So there isn't any training, mandatory training,
mhm.
but there are ways for us to at least get that training in front of them so that they are doing that and we're doing the work of not just always focusing on the patient, but thinking about the physicians as well.
So do you need medical insurance through all phases of trial?
So sometimes medical insurance will come up because certain tests may not be covered, right? So it
Okay.
depends on like the timing. So
Mhm,
when you're in the study, those are usually covered. It's
mhm,
usually during that pre-screening phase, like when you're being screened, that
mhm,
sometimes additional tests may be needed. And when
mhm,
it happens, that's where the person's insurance gets hit. Now, there's been some discussions on can we expand the scope so that that doesn't get affected.
mhm,
But then when you think about the number of screen failures that you do get on studies, especially when let's say you have 100 Black people that come in, and
mhm,
because of this particular study, their screen failure rate's around 65%.
mm,
There's going to be 60 to 65 people out of that 100 that have had these things done, these tests and stuff that were done.
mhm,
And if it's being covered by the study, they're like, hey, you got free, medical information, right?
mhm,
And it's also like along the lines of like that person may or not making it into the study. So you have to start to say, well, when does that stuff start to kick in? And there's been a lot of discussions about that, right? But sometimes those in the beginning cannot be covered. And that's where it gets a little tricky. But I think that because we're now starting to see that that can be an issue more
Mhm.
often, depending, because now that we're broadening the scope
Mhm.
beyond people who are typically coming from middle class, right? And we're starting to broaden that a bit. That you're
Mhm.
like, oh, now I'm starting to see where the gaps are in the system. How do we fix that? But this is where rules, regulatory come in. This is where legal comes in. This is where insurance comes in. And
Mhm.
that's where you're starting to see a lot of more conversations about how do we go about addressing that. But again, that comes down to what we've talked about earlier, access.
The whole point of wanting to talk to Black medical professionals and really think about it, we know that we're not receiving the care or the outcomes that we really like to see. And we know that some of the reason is because it's baked into the system and we're trying to fight against that. So while we know that there's a lot of things that the medical field really needs to do on their end, and hopefully the bills that you talked about today and other things and the research you're doing as well are really helping that. But what can we on our end as Black patients do to help advocate for ourselves and
Oh,
to
yeah.
overcome our reticence to take part in these trials, which, assuming everything is really moving forward, would really be beneficial to our healthy outcomes.
Oh, yeah. There's a couple of different resources that come to top of mind.
Mhm.
One being Black Health Matters.
Mhm.
Love them. I've actually talked at one of their summits. They
Mhm.
do an amazing job of putting together community-focused events where
Mhm.
they'll have companies, pharmaceutical companies, and other biotech come in, patient advocacy groups come in and talk to people. So these are not people who have medical backgrounds. These are not people who have grown up in science. These are the people that you see that live in these communities who are going, I want to know more about this, about my
Mhm.
health. How do
Mhm.
I do better? How do I educate my family?
Mhm.
And they have videos that are on YouTube for people. They have a newsletter that everyone can sign up for. But they
Mhm.
also have events that you can go to, and they have them throughout the United States. So I did the
Mhm.
one in LA, but they're going
Mhm.
to have one that's coming up, I think, in Atlanta soon.
Oh, great.
Um, so you can go to their website. It's amazing. They have articles that are written on it to really help educate people about things. There was an article that was on one of the sessions that I did about the three biggest myths about Black people and clinical trials. And so it's a great resource, right? Really, really good. They'll source you out to other things that you can learn about. So it's a really great source. If you want to talk about what is clinical research,
Mhm.
Research Includes Me is a perfect site for that because it's very, very simple
Mhm.
on what is clinical research, what is the history, what's currently happening, and what do I expect, and
Mhm.
where can I find a trial if I really am
Mhm.
interested in it. Those two for me are the biggest areas of where you can learn. Now, if you go into disease specific, there's tons of patient advocacy groups.
Mhm.
And basically, what you can type in is whatever disease you're looking for, and
Mhm.
then patient group, and Google will show you some of the top
Mhm.
choices for that. And there are some that are very much focused on the Black community that you can look up, but then there's others that are more broad for all patients, where you can have a larger subset of people that you can meet that have the condition similar to you.
Mhm.
But there's many, many different types of resources. I can definitely send you over a list of links, but those would be the ones that I really would look to first.
Mhm.
Talking about clinicaltrials.gov, it is a way for you to learn about trials, but it's not very patient friendly.
Okay.
We had a lot of patients say this is not the best one. So my alternative to clinicaltrials.gov is Power.
Mhm.
And Power has said we want to eliminate basically or replace clinicaltrials.gov with a way for patients to search for studies
Mhm.
based on their condition, their location, and it tells you in very easy to read formats with infographics what you should expect. What does this trial mean? Where
Mhm.
can you find more information?
Mhm.
And they're a new startup company, I think they started about a year or two ago, and they've already been making a lot of waves on things. So those would be my top choices. Black Health Matters, Research Includes Me, and Power.
Mhm.
And then if you want to look for patient groups, just definitely look up the condition and then what the patient group is, and you'll
Mhm.
see a long list of things on Google for where those are at.
Thank you so much for that information. What do you think is most important as we kind of talk about these issues and making sure patients are being seen and heard and understood, and that everyone is learning? Not only are we learning what's helping patients, but also doctors in the medical field are expanding and being more inclusive.
I would say everybody knows that representation is important.
Mhm.
I think for me, what I want people to walk away with knowing is that diversity is not a challenge, it's an opportunity.
Mhm.
There's an opportunity in the sense of revitalizing our science So
Mm-hmm.
we may find out something that is very, very, very revolutionary in a sense of maybe there's a new pathway, a new way of tackling this drug, or whatever the case may be, like
Mm-hmm.
tackling a drug or disease that we never knew before. It's an opportunity because if you're going into these new untapped patient pools of
Mm-hmm.
people, your trials can be finished faster because there's more patients that are there
Mm-hmm.
that are hungry for something. It's an opportunity because now that you've been able to prove that these drugs are effective in
Mm-hmm.
these different groups across different demographics, that now they're more willing to use your drug or your
Mm-hmm.
therapy to go use your diagnostic. And that is a market opportunity. So
Mm-hmm.
there's many different opportunities that we're seeing here that can really change it. And if we're partnering with individuals who look like the patients that we're looking for, you can change the pipeline, which means more and more physicians, right, are going to understand the need for this, which means we
Mm-hmm.
reduce that level of barriers that are happening at that physician level. So there's many opportunities that can come out of this if we have true representation being
Mm-hmm.
thought of all the way through. So that's what I want people to kind of walk away with, because every time I hear someone talking about diversity, it's hard and they don't trust. And I'm like, you guys are looking at this in the wrong way. It is
Mm-hmm.
an opportunity for everyone around, because not only are the patients getting something out of it, but the healthcare system is, our scientists are, businesses are getting something out of it.
Mm-hmm.
It's a win-win all the way around. So if we change that a bit, then I think we'll start to see that. But it
Mm-hmm.
takes time to prove that one, the patients exist, two, that they're interested, and three, that there is something that can come out of it on the other end with them.
Mm-hmm. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bronner, for taking time to speak with us today. We really appreciate all of your information you provided. Like I said, we'll have some links in our video so people can follow up with that. We just thank you so much for your time and all the work that you're already doing out there to make things better.
Thank you for this opportunity to talk about this on your platform, and I really look forward to being able to share more of this type of stuff, because I think the more times that people hear it, the
Mhm.
more it starts to sink in. So I really appreciate to see urban media really doing what they need to do to really raise the awareness about this within our communities.